And welcome back. So we're back on our TRX. We're going to chase a few more electrical gremlins today. And one of those gremlins that come up on the scan tool is the driver's side rear light here. It's saying that it's got a blown bulb. Now, interesting enough, man, hopefully you can see that. If you look inside that lens, hopefully you see what I see. That looks like an aftermarket LED that is in there. And that looks like the same for the bottom. So they've got aftermarket bulbs in here. And as we know from working on the front of the truck on the passenger side, one thing you got to have is that those LEDs have to, again, compensate for the fact that the truck is looking for an incandescent bulb. So chances are that's either gone bad or there's an external resistor pack attached to this light housing that's gone bad. So we're going to get this lens out of here and take a look at what's going on. In case you're curious, most Rams are all set up this way. It's a T25 Torx bit. You got two Torx bits just inside the tailgate door. We're going to start by taking these off, and then the assembly should pop forward. But let's get those Torx bits out and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So you can see we got our lens out, and this is the standard incandescent lens that would come on this year of a Ram. And the top bulb is going to be your turn signal / brake. The bottom bulb is going to be your reverse bulb, and you can see that they have in fact put LED replacements in here. Now here's the top one. Looks like it's a plug-in replacement. Looks like they got a massive heat sink on the top. Looks like your LED elements are actually on the top corners facing down. So chances are either this one or the one here, which this one surprises me. It's just a cute little backup bulb in LED form, but you'll notice it's just a bare circuit card with no cover on it. That's actually kind of surprising. I expected there at least to be some form of a cover over that, but chances are either that one's gone bad or that one has gone bad. Chances are it's probably this one that's gone bad, to be honest with you. The good news is we've got housings and bulbs that we may be able to take out of the old lenses that we took off of our 2500 here, because I still have them in the garage when we updated to LED tails. But what we can do is we can hook these up to a source of 12 volts, try these out, and see if they're still functional. It would be nice if all this is just a simple set of bad LED bulbs. Let's see if they did the same thing over here on the passenger side. Oh, and they have different ones. Check that out. You see that top one there? It is also LED, but it's a different type of LED bulb. It looks like the bottom one's the same. So let me do that. Let me see. Well, for fun, we'll put 12 volts on these and we'll see if they're still viable. But what we can do is, and don't get me wrong, I like LED as much as the next guy, but this truck can get by with just the incandescent lights and the tails, to be honest with you. And if the ones I have in the garage will work in this case, then I'll just steal the bulbs out of it, convert this truck back to incandescent in the rear, and then we should be good, which will be nice because it'll be a nice little, hopefully quick fix on this. And if the individual that will be receiving this truck wants to go back to using LED tails, we can do it. I'll look into getting some tails that will work without throwing the error codes, because there are several out in the market. As a matter of fact, if we pull the LED for the backup out, there we go. You'll see it written on here, how they label it, CAN bus. It's upside down, but CAN bus. So basically it just means it's got the resistors on here, not only to drive the LEDs, because typically LEDs aren't going to be driven at a full 12 volts unless they're 12 volt rated LEDs, but You can see all the resistors on the bottom of that circuit board, and some of those, or if not all of those, are there to again give the truck what it's looking for, to make it think it's still got a incandescent bulb plugged in. But let me get a jump pack out here and get you set up on a tripod, and we'll give these a test, and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So I just want to show this to you. These are the original incandescent LED tails out of the 2016 2500. And to show you something it's kind of interesting and scary at the same time, this is what we just took off the 2009. This is the 2016. That is the exact same tail, rear tail, bulbs, everything. So it didn't change much between a 2009 1500 and a 2016 2500. Apparently they use the exact same rear tail lights. So like I said, worst case scenario, we can pull the bulbs out of the sockets and just use the bulbs out of these, and we should be good. But just to show you, we've got our jump pack giving us a little bit of supply power here. We're getting about 12.42 volts out of our pack. And then what I'm going to do is see about hooking this guy up and see if we can get any light out of this. And again, just to test it. So, one moment. And welcome back. Got you in a tripod here so you can see this. But this is also one of these bulbs, one of these types of LEDs that isn't polarity sensitive. Meaning if I do this, you can see I get no light at all. But if we reverse the polarity, you can see this little backup bulb works just fine. And now, this is common for a lot of these, like older gen LED, and a lot of some of these LED replacements you got to be mindful of, is that if they don't work, take them out, flip them around, put them back in, and then they should. But a lot of the newer ones have that polarity sensitivity in mind. Well, they will work either way inside the socket. But again, just something to be mindful of. The LEDs are polarity sensitive, and depending on the make of whoever's making your LED bulb, they may have compensated for that or they may not. But this one does work, which is good. Which tells me our fault is probably going to lie into this one here. Let's get ourselves some power. Oh, that one actually does work. Nice. Now it could be, yeah, see, this one's got the same problem with the reverse polarity. You notice it won't work that way. We go back, put our polarity the other way around, and it works just fine. So these bulbs are good. So the question is going to be as to whether we've got a wiring problem back here and we're not getting our expected 12 volts, or does this just not have the ability to compensate for the CAN bus errors? Because that can happen. Some of these LED replacements that you get in, if they're not set up correctly and put the correct resistive load on there, they'll still throw a fault. And considering this is a different manufacturer than the one that's on the passenger side, that could be the case. So let's do this. Let me get the passenger one off of here, and we can just kind of take a look at the differences in the bulbs there, and then I'll bring you back. One moment. So welcome back. So we've got our passenger side disconnected or taken out. You can see that the backup bulb is the same LED they had in the driver's side. But you can see this one is significantly different. Again, there's a lot of different varieties and styles in these LED replacements. You just, again, got to be careful what you're getting a hold of. But interesting enough, and like I said, every time I take something apart on this truck, it never ceases to amaze me. But you can see right there and there they've got double-sided sticky tape. Why? Because that should clip into inserts that are supposed to be here in the frame and here in the frame, and you can see that they've broken those out on this one. This one's broken, this one's been lost, and rather than being able to get a hold of the hardware or replace the hardware, they just put double-sided sticky tape on it to hold it in place, which is wore off because it's no longer sticky. So what we're going to have to do is come into here and see if I can find the ones that came with the 2600, because it did come with some spares. Or what we can do is that we can take one of the lights off our donor RAM and just take these clips off to at least clip this light back in here properly. But let me do this. Let me get these bulbs out. We'll give these a quick test, and then I'll bring you back. Thank you much. Okay, so I got you back in the tripod. Let's try the backup bulb. Yep. Well, you can see that one works, but it does actually have a couple of LEDs. It's before we condemn the LEDs, yeah. It's got a couple of LEDs on this side that aren't working, so it's got a couple that are burnt out. Oh, it just came on. Okay, so it was just a loose connection on power. Never mind. You can see they do work. Hopefully that's not blinding you too bad. You can see that one works. All the LEDs work fine. Let's see if we can reverse polarity on this one, whether it matters on this style or not. And yes, it does. There we go. Okay, so now we got a good connection, so it does work that way. Once again, just to double check it. And you can see it doesn't work that way. So yep, this is another model that you just got to be mindful of it being polarity sensitive. Okay, so the bulbs check out. There doesn't seem to be a problem with them. So what I'm going to do is take the incandescent bulbs out of our 2016 lenses, get them in here. We'll see if we can put a power up to the truck and see if our rear tail lights will work at that point. If they do, like I said, I'll go over to our donor RAM and I'll just steal some clips to be able to put this passenger light assembly back on correctly. And one thing we can do to show it to you here. So that's a factory incandescent stop/turn bulb. Show you what I'm talking about here in case you're not familiar with LEDs being polarity sensitive. Incandescents don't care. For instance, you can see that works that way. Take it off, we can put it around the other direction. You're dealing with 2 filaments in this bulb. There you go. See, it works that way. Now, this one you're dealing with 2 filaments. One's a stop, one's a turn, versus what you're dealing with here, which is going to be, you know, they're basically just combining stop and turn into the same housing. Okay, so let me do that. I'm going to go ahead and get these bulbs in. We'll see if we can safely get power to the truck, and then I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So you can see we got our incandescents in, but you can see we've got a problem. On the passenger side here, that bulb is barely lit. Not very strong at all. But on the driver's side, we're fine. It's a bit brighter, but you got to remember it's daylight out here. And watch what happens when I turn on the hazards. This one flashes, but you'll see our backup bulb is also pulsating. I don't believe that should do that. But this one's working correctly. Our brake light is still on. And our hazard light's flashing because the brake pedal's not set in there. This one's doing the same thing. You can see they're both flashing in unison, but you notice how much dimmer they are. And it's probably hard to see out here in the daylight, but you can see how dim that bulb is. We've got a problem on the passenger side for the wiring, or at least the light wiring. As you'll see on this one, on this lens here, now the front and the rear should be independent of each other, but I noticed this as well. So you'll notice that this is flashing the yellow and the whites are on. Okay, it's doing the same thing. Never mind, that's normal. That's right, because I've got the lights on themselves. And that one's working, which that's nice. That's in the mirror. That one's working as well, so that's nice. So the mirrors are good. These seem to be good from the work that we did yesterday. Those are responsive. So let's turn the, sorry for the dinging. Let's turn the lights off and just go with straight hazards. You can see there, we got a nice bright flashing light. That one's still dimly flashing. I don't think it should be doing that. I think we've got a ground issue that we need to hunt down. Yeah, especially on this side. You see that? You see that barely flickering? It's like it's not getting any juice back here at all. So we either got a bad connection or we're dealing with a bad ground. So we'll have to trace that down. You can see there, you can see the lights are lit in the mirror. You can see here, and like I said, they should be independent of each other, but it could be the cause of our issue is that you'll see here where this is flashing both the yellow and the white running lights, and it shouldn't be doing that. It should be just the yellows. It's flashing the side marker, which I believe is fine. Now over here, it's not flashing the side marker, and it's flashing this one, but it's doing just the amber, which is what it should be doing. So we definitely got some funkiness going on the driver's side of everything here that we kind of need to investigate and see if we can track that down. But what I want to do is start with the rear lights, and you'll see that the lights on this driver mirror are much brighter. To include the puddle lights are working. Versus the ones on this side where the puddle lights are barely lit and the lights are flashing, but they're really dim. That kind of reeks to me that we got a potential ground issue on the passenger side. So I'm going to voltmeter out, start doing some voltage checks at the back of those light receptacles, and kind of just see what's going on from there. But since it seems to be the entire passenger side, it could be a centralized ground for that side, or, you know, worst case scenario, it could be the body control module for that side. But I don't know, we're gonna have to do some digging. But unfortunately, we got some looks like we got some more electrical gremlins to chase. But with that being said, let me do some investigating on this end, and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So I got you focused in on the voltmeter here, and after looking at the wiring diagrams, our black wire should be our ground, and I just want to show you what's happening on the passenger side here. You can see we're only getting 5.8 volts on that element. Should be 12. And on this side of the connection for the other filament for that bulb, again, only 5 volts. So we're not getting anywhere near our 12 volts we need back here on the passenger side. So I'm going to go shut this off real quick, bring you back and show you some wiring diagrams, because I've got the truck running off my little laptop, little bench power supply right now. So it's keeping the truck right at 12.5 volts. And right now, with just the running lights on, in case you're curious, we're pulling about 5.5 amps. So let me go ahead and turn that off, and I'll be right back. Okay, sorry to keep you waiting. So we've got to go ahead and shut that off. The other thing I wanted to show you here real quick is if we go to continuity on our meter, and we know our black is in fact our ground. I'm not getting continuity on the ground side over here at all, and I should be. There should be no issue with doing that. I should get a straight check, and we should be able to get the meter to beep, and you can see we're not. So if we come over here to our wiring diagram, and this is going to be pretty much impossible, you could have probably seen. Let me get you out of the sunlight. It's not going to help much, I don't know, because it's very, very small print. But this is our rear right-hand taillight assembly diagram. Our ground is the black or gray, which we were testing on the gray, or the black, I'm sorry. And you saw via the voltmeter, only even if it was only 5 volts, we had our polarity correct. So our black wire in that bundle, or in that connector, should be, according to this diagram, comes down and ties in a body ground 314. Now it's the same, looks like it's the same splice for also the backup light on the right hand side as well. So if we look at our ground location, you can see we got 314 right here. According to this, it is located around the sensor wheel speed ABS left rear. So this has got a ground that's coming over to the driver's side rear and grounding out to the frame. So we need to look at the driver's side, come up to about the frame rail, right above this link right here, according to this diagram, and look and see if we've got a ground line tied into here. Now, we're also looking to see if there is any kind of a splice into that ground circuit, and it doesn't look like there is. It looks like it pretty much runs from both sides and then grounds out. So let's do that next. This is the a non-OE diagram. This is the diagram put out by AllData versus the diagram put out by the manufacturer. One's colored, one's not, but it doesn't make any difference because unfortunately I do not have a color printer. But for the non-OE ones, what you can do is take these edges, line them up, and then you can get a holistic view of the entire, well, in this case it's the exterior lamp circuit for everything. Now, but you got to be careful when you're looking at the diagrams that have been redrawn. Sometimes they're mistakes and they're not accurate. So the non-OE, or I should say the OE ones, are telling us that we're sharing a body ground 314 on the driver's side here. So we want to check for that. And the reason why I'm checking for that first is because, again, we did the continuity check. I didn't see a ground on this side. And because the bulbs are very weak, and we're also seeing oddities in which when we had the hazards on, you saw the backup lights also flash, which shouldn't happen. That tells me there's a lack of a ground somewhere, and electricity is always going to find its way to ground. So it's going through another component to be able to complete that circuit. So that's why we want to verify our grounds. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to get up underneath the driver's side here and see if I can find this point, and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So I'm just want to show you what I'm doing here to troubleshoot this. Is I'm probed into the ground connector for the tail light, the main stop and turn signal tail light on both sides. And be careful when you're front probing a connector. You don't want to space out that pin fitment so it causes the connection problem when you go to put your lights on. Just be careful when you're doing this. I'm using very small probes out of the AesWave test kit. I'll put a link in the description. It's a bit of a pricey kit, but very, very handy when you get into doing stuff like this. But just to show you, since we know for the wiring diagram, the ground on both left and right hand side should be tied together in that central ground point, that G314, you should be able to get a continuity check between both grounds. The meter should tone, but you'll see you got about 570 ohms of resistance between these two. That's not good. Should not be that high. And I did test it a bit further to show you here what I'm talking about. Is that because all the rear lights on here share the same ground, then the backup bulb and the turn signal bulb, which this is the ground for the backup, I'm just going to probe the front, which is the black. You can hear that tone. So we know we got continuity between this ground and this ground. So these two bulbs on this side are good. They can still see one another. But when we try the same test on this side, this ground and that ground can't see one another. So we've got a ground problem, definite ground problem between this side and the chassis, between this side and this side, and between this side and this side. It's all kind of pointing to the same thing. I did find ground 314, what appears to be ground 314. Is on the driver's side here, just inside the fender liner. Looks like it's that guy right there tied to the frame. So what I needed to do next is chase down that wire loom a little bit and make sure that the ground wires just aren't broke between there and here. And I've already tried a continuity test directly from where we're probed into those connectors back here to this, and it's dead on both sides. So it could be that we've got corrosion in here. We'd have to unwrap it and make sure that, you know, none of these multiple strands are broken. Chrysler loves to take multiple grounds, tie them into one big grommet, and then smash it onto the frame. So we'll have to take a look at that. But I want to trace it down from the wiring harness and the taillight fittings first back here, just to make sure it isn't broke further up the chain. So basically we're in investigation mode at this point. Is that we know we got a broken ground between here and the rear somewhere, and the question now is, now we need to find it. And I'm going to trace this down a little bit, and I'll call you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So as you can see, things have escalated. Got most of this section of harness de-wrapped at this point. It was just cloth tape. Now, these are the grounds here, these three that are coming over from the passenger side rear. And what this is, from what I can tell, is one ground feeds stop and turn, one ground for backup, the other ground goes over to the license plate light. Now, the driver's side ground wiring does something rather interesting. I need to go back and check the wiring diagrams, and this is probably the reason why this is partially working. If you look at the grounds here and the rest of the harness, 3 of these, or actually should be, looks like 4 of these, which would make sense because you've got a rather thick one in here, which looks like it goes to the trailer harness. You've got 3 thinner ones, one of which goes to the ground connector, which is probably the back taillight light. The other 2 on the driver's side, they do something rather interesting. So this looks like the ground for the stop and turn, and then the backup, you can see they splice it. And then this splice doesn't end up on G314. Where the passenger side is, it goes further up the harness. So that explains why this would be partially working on this side, but not on the passenger, and why the passenger is acting kind of wonky, because it looks like we could potentially have a good ground on this side, on the driver's side, and a bad ground, because you can see here I'm clipped right to the ground spade. Got the meter on continuity, and I'm plugged in over there and not getting any continuity reading on this at all, which is, yeah, again, fairly interesting. So I'm going to do one more test. I want to see if I can tap into one of the passenger side ground wires directly, because I want to do a continuity test from here directly back. And actually what I may do, because what I'm thinking about, I'm thinking the issue is right here inside this ground connector. Now I've wiggled it and twisted it and turned it, and obviously, again, you can see these are our ground wires from the passenger side. They do in fact come over here and route in with all this other ground bundle, so they should get here. So if I do a continuity check from here to there, we should get some kind of continuity. So I'm going to test that. Again, we tested it earlier, but now that I'm clipped onto the actual ground stud, I want to see if I get a signal or not. And then I'm going to have to trace down on the wiring diagrams where the driver's side actually grounds to make sure that isn't broken elsewhere in the harness, also contributing to our problem. So let me do that. Let me get the meter swapped over to the passenger side, because again, I want to test this terminal directly. If it doesn't test okay, then I'll probably cut the ground wires off for the passenger side, bundle them together in a new connector, and actually do that to all of these. I'm not going to put a connector on here that contains all of these grounds. I'll more than likely cut it, put multiple connectors on here, and put it back on the same stud. But let me do this one continuity check, and I'll bring you back. Talk to you in a bit. Bye. And welcome back. So we ran that test in which the passenger side is grounding to this lug, and we actually do have continuity. What we don't have continuity to is the ground on the opposite side. Now, interesting enough, went back and looked at the wiring diagrams, and as we spoke about before, there's a splice. So they are in fact splicing the ground for the turn and the stop and the backup into a single wire. It actually doesn't terminate here. It goes forward and terminates to another ground point that, according to the diagram, should be ground 206, and it shows it inside underneath the driver's steering wheel. But I'll be darned if I can find this thing. Now, interesting enough, wanted to prove out the wire. So we're still plugged into the ground on this end, and we know the splice is good because we got continuity between the 2 grounds on this side. You might be asking yourself the question, why am I chasing down a ground issue, or what looks to be a ground issue, if we're only getting 5 or so volts on that side? Well, it goes into the same body connector up front, which I'm getting ready to show you. And again, to me, it just reeks that we've got a bad ground, especially with it flashing the backup lights when you turn the hazards on. Let's see here. So, but according to the diagrams, again, this just goes to another grounding point, which means it should be okay. I should get connectivity between this set of grounds, even though they're grounded back here, and this set of grounds, even though it's grounded further up. Now, what I am getting, when you check connectivity between these two grounds, is a 600 and something ohm connection. And if they are in fact going to ground points, which is all tied to chassis ground, everything in theory should behave the same. So let me show you this. So you can see we got our meter set up for continuity. Used about every meter extension lead I had. We're plugged into the ground side on the driver. Going forward, looking at our pin diagrams, the only place it has a connector where it can be broken is right here underneath the driver's side. Now, I went ahead and obviously when I disconnected this, I saw the one resistance reading we were getting on the meter go to 0, so I definitely know it's this one. Plus, per our diagram, it should be pin 14, but I'm finding that not to necessarily be the case. And in fact, I did find it, and it is this pin right here. And hopefully you can hear the meter saying that we have connectivity. So we've proved out the ground wire from back there all the way through our wiring harness up to where we have our connector here. So we know the wiring is good. Now this other side of this, and there's only one singular black wire, which that's the other side of the connector. That's the one that it matches up to. That one goes further up, of course, behind everything. So I'd have to trace it down further to see exactly where it's tying into. But like I said, according to the diagram, ground 206 is supposed to be on the front left-hand side, you know, kind of underneath the dash, which is, you know, kind of weird. I'm not quite sure why they ground the driver's side and turn signal all the way up into the cab when they could have just attached the same grounding point as everything else behind. I'm sure they had a reason for it. I don't know what that reason would have been. But like I said, I'm having difficulty finding that ground point because the ground point that I did find underneath the dash does not have a solid black wire or any kind of black with a tracer. It has a bunch of black with gold. It looks like they're all grounds, but they're grounds for items that are inside the cab, not something that's coming out. So what I may do, just to make things a bit easier, is see if I can get this wheel well liner out of here, or at least pulled back, because all this is doing, and pardon for the camera work, let me get you flipped around here. This just runs behind this fender liner, goes up, and I'll show you, goes into the main harness right here on the firewall. So that black wire is either going into the firewall or potentially getting routed up here where you see another set of grounds, but that's not where this ground is supposed to be going. Now the good news is, now that we've identified the pin, we can pin out the other side of that connector and test it to ground and see if we get a good reading. If we get a bad reading, then we know there's an issue with that wire from the other side of the connector, you know, onward. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to just get a setup going, or I can do some testing from the opposite side. In other words, from the opposite side of the connector coming up into here, and see if I can just test it against a body ground and see what kind of reading that we're gonna get. And if I have to, like I said, I'll just pull the fender liner out of the driver's side here. That'll allow us to look at that little pigtail piece of conduit that's coming up, and you can see it blends in with this main wire and harness bundle. You know, there's several other grounds that go into here, so it's kind of hard to see the one that we need. And again, I just want to verify that, you know, we're good from the connector, from the other side of that mating connector up. And because again, if the other side of this wire is truly going to a body ground, I shouldn't be seeing 600 and something ohms of resistance unless something is wrong with that ground connector. That's what I'm going to do next, and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. Okay, welcome back. You can see we got our meter down in there. We've got an alligator clip going to the pin, sorry for the bright light, on the other side of the connector. So this would be from that body connector coming up into here. And just out of curiosity, this is what I'm going to do. This is just a chassis ground, and you can hear our meter. You can see there we got a 0 for our resistance, and we're beeping away. So what we've done is we've verified the ground from the driver's side connector up, from the other side of the connector up into just using a body ground on the cab, and we have continuity. So wherever this ground point is going after it leaves this other connector, again, that ground 206 is, according to the meter, stable. Now, interesting enough, when we tried this going back, again, we were getting a high resistance connection. So I've got some contact cleaner. You can see down here, it's just some WD-40 contact cleaner. I've already sprayed it down. I'm going to give it one more spritzing, let it dry. Then I'm going to reassemble that connector, and then we're going to test just to see if maybe all of this could have just been, you know, just a bad connection, giving us that high resistance to ground. But we shall see. I'm going to go ahead and take care of that, and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So we got our connector contact cleaned. We got it all reassembled, and I want to show you something interesting. So once again, driver's side tied into the ground. And the reason why we're using this one is because, remember, it's not, we discovered it's not tied into the ground back here with everything else that ties to this chassis ground. Now remember that this chassis ground. So I've got the other side of the meter here. You see I can touch that chassis ground, and we've got no connectivity on that ground. Now, to prove to you that it's working, remember these two grounds on the driver's side, backup bulb and other bulb, are tied together. So I'm just going to touch the ground on the backup bulb, and you hear the meter go off. So we're testing between here and here. So we had no connectivity between this ground and this body, which the passenger side is grounded to, along with several other things. Forgive the camera work. I've got to get this cabling situated. Once again, we're running like every test lead I have joined together to get this thing long enough. Watch this. Watch what happens when we come up front. We get a little bit more personal. Hold on, I'm caught. I just put it in the door handle there. I know, stellar camera work. You have to forgive me. Hear that? Going to the front body ground. It's fine. We have connectivity back to our driver's side ground, but we do not have connectivity between driver's side ground and chassis ground. So that tells me we have got a grounding issue between the chassis and the body. There's a ground missing or broken somewhere. So what we need to do in order to fix this is that we need to create a ground between the chassis and the body, and that should resolve our issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside the house and get some wire and put a couple of lugs on it, and I'm going to look for a spot where we can kind of tie these two together. Now from the factory there should be some points we can tie into. Now I'm gonna make one versus trying to find one. Now one thing that will give you a chassis ground to a body ground, but I wouldn't want to run everything across it, is that, remember, the cylinder heads are tied together, they're grounded, and it clips over into the body, so it would ground the body to the motor. The motor is then grounded to the chassis because it's bolted onto the engine mounts. But what I want to do is create myself a ground wire either on this lug or that lug back there, and take it down and attach it to the body. And the question is going to be as to where do we want to attach, and then it should resolve our issue. Let's see. Okay, let me ponder on this a bit, but right now that's the way it's looking based on our test, based on our findings, based on the fact that I can come up here and ground again to the rear driver ground, which is not tied into the rear passenger ground, case in point. Attach it to a body ground, I get connectivity. Attach it to the chassis, I get nothing. And everything should be grounded. Chassis should be grounded to the body and vice versa. And I believe that's going to be the bulk of the root cause of our problem. And Lord knows whatever other issues, electrical issues, this truck could also be presenting with. Grounds are important. Without them, you see a lot of weird stuff like this where lights work but they're dim, or like you saw when we turned the hazards on and it was also flashing the backup bulbs, because without a ground, everything on the passenger side here in the rear is ground to the body. And you just saw that we had no connectivity between everything on the passenger side is ground to the chassis, and we have no ground between chassis and body. And that's going to cause some issues, because in a case like this, again, why they did this I don't know, but it's a good thing they did in our case, because again, that ground on the driver's side is independent of the ground used on the passenger side. This one is running up, and according per documentation, it's grounding to a ground point that is supposedly on the inside of the cab, left-hand side, somewhere up underneath the dash, which would make it a body ground. So again, that's where it's going to be. That's where it's going to be sitting. I'll be looking for a place that I can tap something into, and I may have just found it. Right there is a ground point that grounds the fuel door, so when you're filling things up, you don't create an electrostatic spark. It, not that it doesn't create one, but it makes the potential of your filler neck, which is metal, the same potential as your body ground. I should say chassis ground, sorry. So what I'm gonna do is, I've got this nice bracket right here, which is body. We can just make up a small length of cable and join the two, and that should give us a ground between the body and the chassis. And then we should be good. And then we'll have to research where those other grounds are supposed to be. Chances are they've been ripped off or removed by, you know, who knows what. And then we'll have to get all that taped back up, loomed, and then get that ground point remade. But I'm going to focus on that, and I'll bring you back and show you what I come up with. Thank you much. Bye. And welcome back. Well, everybody, watch this. Ground on the passenger side tail. Ground on the driver's side tail. Meters in continuity mode. Check that out. And if you remember, we couldn't do that before. So that is the tail slash turn slash stop. Now for the backup bulb, should do the same thing. I'm just going to probe the ground, which is the black wire on this one. Try to keep this in the shot. I'm just going to touch it. Hear that? We're good. So we now have ground connectivity between the two sides. We know this side is tied into chassis. That side is tied in the body, and now they're tied together, which as it should be. So we found the issue. The one tie-in point that I could find that ties the chassis into the body is obviously through the main wiring harness. So that was this is the wiring harness connection ground that goes to the chassis. Driver's side wheel well. Right there. That was loose. Wasn't making good contact. Had to be tightened. And notice that's chassis. So the main negative of the wiring harness, at least in this case, on the driver's side, ties into there for the chassis. Ties in here. Ties in here for the body. And that ties the two together. Which you can now see that we now have connectivity. And all grounds are equal footing at this point in the rear of this truck. So that was fun. So we didn't have a pin fitment issue. We didn't have a connector issue. We didn't have a broken wire, as we saw. What we had ended up being, as we theorized, we knew we had a ground problem, but wasn't sure exactly where that ground problem was. So we traced the wiring harness. It was okay. We looked at the ground tie-in on this side. I got a little bit confused. I thought they all tied into this point. Looked back at the wiring diagrams, realized the driver's side did not. Remember, it goes forward, ties into a main connector. That connector then goes inside the cab and ties into the body. Took apart that connector cleaned it, made no change, finally looked over the engine compartment and noticed that one ground going to the chassis, which is off a main negative cable, was loose. Tightening that back up, checked connectivity. We now have connectivity between here and the chassis ground that the passenger side is tied to, and as you just saw, we can now check connectivity or continuity between negative here, or between ground on driver and ground on passenger. So we should now be good. We should be able to finish wrapping up and putting new tape back on the harness, tightening that ground connection back up, putting the lights back in, and then we'll get a jump pack on here or a temporary power supply. But we should now be able to do things like again, turn on the hazards, turn on the lights without seeing the weirdness where that backup bulb was flashing on both sides, and then the passenger side being extremely dim, as well as, you remember, even the turn signal on the backup mirror for the passenger side was also dim. So this should fix our issues. Again, I'm going to go ahead and work on getting that wiring harness underneath rewrapped, re-secured, and then we'll put the lights back in and we'll give this a try. I'll bring it back in. Thank you much. And welcome back. So we got the underside of it taken care of, got it rewrapped. I'll show you all that. Borrowed some clips from our donor ram to put our headlight back on, but as you can see, we're now running our accessory lights. We have a nice bright bulb on both sides. Let's check out our... Okay, yep, it's not on with the side mirror. Yep, we got a marker light, and a bottom light, marker light, and a bottom light. Good. Now let's go for broke here. Turn these off. Turn our hazards on. You can see we got a nice bright hazard light. No flashing on the backup. Nice bright hazard. No flashing on the backup. We got flashing here. Good, good, good. Flashing here. You'll notice this time there isn't a white light flashing. Flashing there. Okay, yeah, I got a power supply is kind of unable to keep up with that amount. Turn that off. Okay, so that's good. That's working. That's working. That's working. So if we just turn that back on to lights on, you can see that we got our puddle light underneath here. Well, of course, this side wasn't really dim. All that now looks good. All that looks good. And we do have puddle lights here, but the puddle lights are still a little bit dim on that one. That could just be something within the housing itself. There we go. There's our accessory. Nice. And there's our accessory. So we've got equal brightness on both sides. All of that now looks good. And let's see, I think that's about it. That will wrap this one up. Let me go underneath and show you this. Hopefully you can see that. We just rewrapped everything in the cloth wrapping because that's what was on here when we took it off. We put in some new Christmas tree clip zip tie holders in some couple spots where we took it out. And most importantly, we made sure our ground back here was secure. So to recap our issue, you know, we started out well enough by just saying, all right, you know, we're gonna change the lights out and you get rid of the LEDs because we were having a bulb out issue, remember, on this side. So we did that. Then when we powered everything up, we saw all the anomalous problems we were having, such as when you turn the turn signals on, you put the hazards on, the backup bulb was flashing. When you had the lights on like you do right now, this bulb would be extremely dim, and this one would flash. Even with the hazards gone, this one would be dim, which everything pointed to a ground issue. So when I looked at the wiring diagrams initially, I saw that all the grounds were tied into this ground point behind here where the rear tire was. I mistakenly took that to be all the grounds to include the driver's side rear. And that was a mistake on my part. Kind of led me into a little bit of wild goose chase. Again, we took apart the harness, verified everything looked okay, and then when we took that harness apart, we noticed that this ground and this ground were spliced together and actually run up into the cab. So with that being noticed, we now knew that the passenger side grounded on the frame and the driver's side grounded elsewhere. So we traced down that connector that you saw and then ohmed out the wire, or toned it out, continuity tested it between here and the first part of the connector was good. And then we did a continuity test between the second half of that big connector to chassis ground, body ground, and then that worked fine. And then that led us to test, all right, can we test ground between here and chassis? And that's when we ran into an issue. Remember, between here and body it worked, but between here and chassis, nothing. So I thought I was going to have to make a ground cable to make that union. We looked in the engine compartment, found that loose ground wire, tightened it up, and if you remember, when we tested, we could then test continuity between this ground on driver and that ground on passenger, as well as testing between this ground here and that grounding point on the frame. In other words, verifying that we now have grounding between body and chassis. So it's a little bit of a runaround it led us on for having that loose connection, but it's done. We learned a lot in the process. Again, just kind of following our wiring diagrams, we now know that the driver's side, at least for the rear taillights, are grounded differently than the passenger side. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up at this point. I'm going to go ahead and put these lenses on and get everything wrapped up. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. Or again, just continuing to grow the channel so that we can do more and more and more. And with that being said, I thank you for sticking around, listening to my ramblings. And admittedly, one loose ground had us going on a pretty wild goose chase. So it's just, in other words, just emphasizing the point that always check your powers and grounds, double check your grounds. And again, having a really dim bulb on one side, okay on the other, and seeing that backup bulb flash when the hazards were on was a pretty clear indication to me that we were dealing with some type of a ground issue. But again, never go with an assumption. Always pull your diagrams out. Always do your due diligence and your troubleshooting. And with that being said, I will talk to you later. Thank you much. Bye.